The silence in the VIP room of the Obsidian was louder than any scream. Seconds ago, Sheikh Omar al-Rashid, a man worth billions, had been laughing, mocking the waitress in a language he was certain she didn't understand. He had called her worthless. He had called her invisible. But now, his crystal glass hung suspended in the air, his knuckles white. The invisible waitress, Ruby, hadn't just cleaned the table. She had just turned around, locked eyes with him, and responded in flawless, poetic Arabic, exposing his darkest business secret in front of his rivals. The hunter had just become the prey. Ruby Vance adjusted the collar of her stiff, black uniform and exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. The air inside the Obsidian, Manhattan's most exclusive, members-only supper club, smelled of truffle oil, aged mahogany, and money. It was a scent Ruby knew well, though lately she only smelled it from the service side of the swinging kitchen doors. "Table 4 is yours tonight, Vance," the floor manager, Julian, snapped, thrusting a tablet into her hands. Julian was a man who confused anxiety with leadership. "And don't screw it up. It's the Al-Rashid party. They just landed from Dubai. If his water glass drops below half full, you're out on the street. Understood?" "Understood, Julian," Ruby said, her voice steady. She didn't flinch. She was 26, but her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. 3 years ago, Ruby hadn't been serving tables. She had been finishing her master's degree in linguistics at Georgetown, the daughter of a prominent diplomat stationed in the Middle East. She had spent her childhood in Cairo, Beirut, and Amman. She spoke 4 languages fluently, her Arabic specifically honed to the sharp, aristocratic dialect of the Gulf elite. But that life had evaporated the night her father was indicted in a massive, fabricated embezzlement scandal that froze their assets and shattered their reputation. He died of a heart attack a month later, leaving Ruby with nothing but debts and a blacklisted surname. Now, she was just the help. She walked onto the floor, her posture perfect. She moved with the grace of a ghost, designed to be present but unseen. Table 4 was the center of gravity in the room. 3 men sat there, but only one mattered, Sheikh Omar al-Rashid. He was younger than the photos in the Financial Times suggested, perhaps early 30s, with a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that looked like they were constantly assessing the price of everyone in the room. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than Ruby would earn in 5 years. Flanking him were 2 older men, his advisors, nervous and sweating despite the climate control. They were terrified of him. Ruby could see it in the way they fidgeted with their silverware. Sparkling water, chilled, no ice, and a bottle of the 82 Petrus. Omar commanded without looking up from his phone. His voice was a deep baritone, accustomed to instant obedience. He spoke English with a clipped, British boarding school accent. "Right away, sir," Ruby said softly. She retreated to the bar, her hands trembling slightly. She knew who Omar was. Everyone did. He was the CEO of Rashid Global, currently in New York to negotiate the acquisition of Sterling Dynamics, a struggling American tech firm. The news had been speculating about it for weeks. If the deal went through, thousands of American workers would lose their jobs as Omar stripped the company for parts. When she returned with the water and the wine, Omar was in the middle of a story. He didn't pause as she poured. He didn't lean back. To him, she was a robotic arm, a mechanism for delivering liquid. "The Americans are desperate," Omar said to his advisors in English, swirling the wine. "Sterling is begging for the buyout. He thinks he's saving his legacy. He has no idea I'm going to dissolve the pension fund the morning after we sign." Ruby felt a cold spike in her chest. Her hand hovered over the glass for a fraction of a second too long. Dissolve the pension fund. It was monstrous. But she forced herself to finish the pour, twist the bottle to catch the drop, and step back. "Is something wrong?" Omar asked sharply, sensing the hesitation. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. "No, sir," Ruby replied, lowering her gaze. "Enjoy the vintage." "Go away." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, like shooing a fly. Ruby retreated to the shadows of the service station. She watched him. She hated him, not just for his wealth, but for the casual cruelty. He was exactly the kind of man who had destroyed her father, powerful, unaccountable, and convinced that the world existed solely for his amusement. But as the night wore on and the wine bottles emptied, the conversation at table 4 shifted, and so did the language. By 10 p.m., the atmosphere at table 4 had loosened. The heavy Petrus was gone, replaced by a rare cognac. Omar al-Rashid leaned back in his leather chair, his tie loosened slightly. The mood was celebratory, arrogant. Ruby approached to clear the dinner plates. As she reached for a charger plate, Omar switched from English to Arabic. "Look at her," Omar said in Arabic. His dialect was rapid, a Gulf accent thick with slang, assuming total privacy in a New York restaurant. "Have you ever seen something so drab? She moves like a funeral procession." One of the advisors, a man named Yusuf, laughed nervously. "She is just doing her job, Sheikh Omar." "She is a peasant," Omar countered, his eyes tracking Ruby's hands as she stacked the plates. "Look at those hands. Rough, red. She probably scrubs floors when she isn't serving us. It's tragic, really. Americans talk so much about opportunity, yet they let their women rot in servitude." Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs. Every word was a slap. She understood every syllable. The nuance, the tone, the specific derogatory word he used for peasant. It was all crystal clear. She kept her face a mask of stone. "Do not react," she told herself. "You are invisible. You are nobody." She continued clearing the table, her movements precise. "Forget the girl," the second advisor, Hakim, said in Arabic. "We need to discuss the Sterling meeting tomorrow. Are you sure about the numbers? If Mr. Sterling finds out about the hidden debt in our subsidiary, the deal collapses." Ruby froze internally. This was sensitive information. Omar laughed, taking a sip of cognac. "Hakim, you worry too much. Sterling is an idiot. He is so focused on the cash injection that he hasn't looked at the auditing of our shell company in the Caymans. We are buying his company with money that doesn't technically exist. By the time the regulators figure it out, we will have stripped the assets and moved the capital to Singapore." Ruby almost dropped a fork. This wasn't just arrogance, this was fraud. Omar was admitting to leveraging a massive deal with non-existent capital. He was going to ruin a historic American company using smoke and mirrors. "It is risky, Omar," Yusuf whispered. "If anyone knew—" "Who is going to know?" Omar sneered, gesturing vaguely at Ruby, who was now wiping down the table. "This one. Look at her. She has the intelligence of a camel. She thinks we are discussing the weather. To people like her, we are just ATMs with legs." He looked directly at Ruby, a cruel smirk on his face, and switched back to English. "More napkins. And make it fast." "Yes, sir," Ruby said. Her voice was tight. The rage was building in her gut, hot and liquid. She walked back to the kitchen, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the counter. Julian, the manager, marched over. "Vance, why is table 4 looking around? They need service." "They are insulting me, Julian," Ruby whispered, her face pale, "and they are discussing illegal business practices." Julian rolled his eyes. "I don't care if they are planning to blow up the moon, Vance. They are spending $20,000 tonight. Get back out there and smile. If you upset the sheikh, you're fired, and I'll make sure you don't get a reference for a job at a fast food joint." Ruby looked at Julian. She looked at the swinging doors. She thought about her rent, which was 2 months overdue. She thought about the ramen noodles waiting for her at home. She swallowed her pride. "Yes, Julian." She grabbed a fresh stack of linen napkins and walked back out. But the dynamic had changed. Omar was bored, and a bored billionaire was a dangerous thing. He was looking for entertainment. As she placed the napkins on the table, Omar reached out and deliberately tipped his cognac snifter. The amber liquid splashed across the pristine white tablecloth and dripped onto Ruby's apron. It wasn't an accident. He had looked her in the eye when he did it. The sound of the heavy crystal glass hitting the table was a dull thud, followed by the wet splatter of expensive alcohol. "Oh, look what you've done," Omar said loudly in English, his voice dripping with mock outrage. Heads at nearby tables turned. The ambient music seemed to stop. Ruby stood frozen, the cognac soaking through her apron, staining her white shirt underneath. "Sir, I didn't touch the glass." "Are you calling me a liar?" Omar stood up, his height imposing. He loomed over her. "You are clumsy. You bumped the table. And now you have ruined a $400 shot of cognac in my mood." "I was nowhere near the glass, sir," Ruby said, her voice rising slightly, defending her dignity. "Silence!" Omar snapped. He turned to the room, performing for the audience. "This is the service at the Obsidian? I come here to spend money, and I am treated like this? I am assaulted by incompetence." Julian, the manager, came running across the dining room, sweating profusely. "Sheikh Omar, sir, what happened? I am so terribly sorry." "This girl," Omar pointed a manicured finger at Ruby, "spilled my drink, and then she dared to argue with me. She is rude, she is dirty, and she is clearly stupid." He switched to Arabic, speaking to his friends, assuming Ruby couldn't follow the sheer venom of his next words. "She is trash," Omar hissed in Arabic. "Just a piece of American garbage. Throw her out so we can enjoy our evening. I bet she can't even read the menu, let alone understand manners." Julian turned to Ruby, his face purple with rage. "Vance, I told you! Apologize to the sheikh immediately!" Ruby looked at Julian, then she looked at Omar. Omar was smirking. It was a smile of total victory. He had crushed her just because he could. Because he was bored. Because he thought she was nothing. He thought her silence was submission. He thought her uniform made her deaf to his language. Something inside Ruby didn't just break, it realigned. The fear of losing her job vanished, replaced by the cold steel resolve of a diplomat's daughter who had watched her father face down dictators. She took a step forward. She ignored Julian. She looked Omar dead in the eyes. The room went quiet. People sensed a confrontation. "Apologize!" Julian hissed. Ruby took a deep breath. She didn't speak English. "There is a difference between silence and stupidity, Sheikh Omar," Ruby said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it projected perfectly. She spoke in Arabic. But not just street Arabic. She spoke in the formal poetic Fusha, the classical Arabic of scholars and kings, infused with the specific, aristocratic cadence of the upper class. Omar's smirk vanished instantly. His eyes went wide. The two advisors dropped their forks. Ruby continued, her Arabic flowing like water, perfect in grammar and pronunciation. "You called me trash. You called me a peasant. You assumed that because I serve your food, I am beneath your notice. But true nobility, Sheikh, is not found in the silk of your suit, but in the content of your character, and yours is lacking." A gasp went through the table. Omar stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly open. He couldn't process what was happening. The invisible girl was speaking his mother tongue better than he was. Ruby wasn't finished. She took a step closer to the table, her eyes blazing. "You mocked my hands," she continued in Arabic. "These hands work for a living. They do not steal. Can you say the same, Sheikh? You speak of the sterling deal. You speak of the Cayman audit. You speak of money that doesn't technically exist. You boast about dissolving pension funds of innocent workers." The color drained from Omar's face. He looked like he had been shot. This wasn't just a waitress clapping back. This was a witness. "You are a fraud, Omar al-Rashid," Ruby said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, still in Arabic. "And you have been shouting your crimes in a room full of people, assuming you were the only one with ears. As the poet Al-Mutanabi wrote, if you see the lion's teeth, do not assume the lion is smiling." She switched back to English, looking at the terrified manager. "You don't have to fire me, Julian. I quit." She unpinned her name tag and dropped it onto the table, right next to the spilled cognac. It made a sharp clack. "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen," she said. Ruby turned on her heel and walked away. The dining room was dead silent. Every eye was on her. She walked with her head high, her back straight, marching toward the exit. Behind her, Omar al-Rashid sank back into his chair, his hands shaking, his business empire suddenly hanging by the thread of a waitress's memory. The silence that fell over the obsidian after the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind Ruby Vance was absolute. It was the vacuum left by a sudden explosion. For a full 10 seconds, no one at table 4 moved. Omar al-Rashid stared at the empty space where the waitress had stood, the echo of her perfect damning Arabic ringing in his ears. The spilled cognac soaked into the tablecloth, an expensive stain spreading like blood. Julian, the manager, was the first to break the paralysis. He was vibrating with panic. "Sheikh Omar, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. She never spoke a word. I will ensure she is blacklisted from every establishment in the city. I will." "Shut up, you fool!" Omar roared, slamming his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. The facade of the bored aristocrat was gone. In its place was raw, terrified aggression. He turned to his advisors. Yusuf was pale, clutching his chest. Hakim was frantically typing on his phone, perhaps trying to calculate how fast they could liquidate their assets and flee the country. "Did you hear her?" Omar hissed at them, ignoring the staring diners around them. She understood everything. The Sterling deal, the Cayman accounts, the pension fund scheme, everything. "She is nobody, Omar," Yusuf stammered, trying to convince himself. "A waitress. Who will believe her? It is her word against yours." "It's not just her word," Omar snapped. "She knows the specifics. She knows the name of the auditing firm in the Caymans. If she mentions that name to anyone at the SEC, or, God forbid, to Mr. Sterling before we sign tomorrow at noon, the deal is dead. And if the deal dies, the banks call in the loans on Rashid Global. We are finished. We will be in prison by the weekend." The weight of the situation crashed down on them. They weren't dealing with a disgruntled employee complaining about a tip. They were dealing with a corporate whistleblower who held a nuclear bomb. Omar turned back to Julian, his eyes predatory. "Give me her file, now." "Her file? But sir, it is confidential employee information," Julian began, clinging to protocol like a life raft. Omar stood up, leaning over so close that Julian could smell the cognac on his breath. "If you do not have her full name, address, and social security number on this table in 2 minutes, I will buy this building just to evict you. I will destroy your life." Julian squeaked and sprinted toward the office. Outside in the cold Manhattan air, Ruby Vance was leaning against the brick wall of the alley, hyperventilating. The adrenaline that had fueled her performance was crashing. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. What had she just done? She was homeless in 3 days if she didn't pay rent. She had just thrown away her only source of income, and she had just declared war on a man whose net worth was greater than the GDP of some small countries. A man who had just casually admitted to massive financial fraud. Men like Omar al-Rashid didn't just get mad when they were exposed. They got even. They made problems disappear. She was a problem. She fumbled for her cracked smartphone. She had one contact left from her old life, someone she hadn't spoken to in 2 years because the shame of her downfall was too great. She dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a groggy female voice answered. "Hello? Who is this calling at 11 at night?" "Sarah, it's Ruby. Ruby Vance." Silence on the other end. Then, a gasp. "Ruby? Oh my God, where have you been? I thought you fell off the face of the earth after your dad. After everything." Sarah Jenkins was an investigative financial journalist for the New York Chronicle. She was tenacious, brilliant, and the only person who had believed Robert Vance was innocent. "Sarah, I need help," Ruby whispered, tears finally stinging her eyes. "I did something stupid. I just confronted Omar al-Rashid." "The Dubai billionaire? The one trying to buy Sterling Dynamics?" Sarah's tone shifted instantly from sleepy friend to sharp reporter. "Yes. I was waiting on his table. He didn't know I spoke Arabic. He confessed to fraud, Sarah. Massive fraud to leverage the Sterling buyout. And I told him I heard it, in Arabic." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Sarah said, "Where are you right now?" "In the alley behind the obsidian on 5th. "Don't move," Sarah commanded. "I'm coming to get you." "If Omar al-Rashid knows you have that information, you aren't safe on the street. Stay in the shadows. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Ruby hung up and pressed herself deeper into the alcove of the brick wall. She watched the street. Every black SUV that passed made her heart stop. The hunter had become the prey, but the prey was about to arm herself. The next morning, the sunlight streaming into Sarah Jenkins' cramped Queens apartment felt too aggressive for Ruby's pounding headache. She hadn't slept. She spent the night recounting every detail of the conversation at table 4, while Sarah furiously took notes on a yellow legal pad. "This is dynamite, Ruby," Sarah said, pacing the small living room with a mug of black coffee. "If we can corroborate the existence of that Cayman auditing firm, we can blow the Sterling deal out of the water before noon today. We can clear your dad's name by showing this is how these guys operate." "But we have no proof," Ruby murmured, curled up on the worn sofa. "Just my word. Omar will call me a disgruntled liar looking for a payout." "That's why we need to provoke him," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. "If he's scared, he'll act. And when he acts, he makes mistakes." The mistake didn't take long to arrive. At 9:30 a.m., Ruby's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Sarah nodded at her to answer it and put it on speaker. "Hello," Ruby said tentatively. "Miss Vance, this is Marcus Thorne." The voice was gravel and ice. Thorne was a legendary fixer in New York, an ex-CIA operative, whom billionaires called when they needed things cleaned up quietly. "What do you want?" Ruby asked. "My employer would like to have a conversation with you to apologize for the misunderstanding last night," Thorne said smoothly. "He feels terrible about the spilled drink and your sudden departure. He wants to make things right." "Tell him I'm not interested in his apologies," Ruby said, her voice steadier now, with Sarah encouraging her silently. "He insists," Thorne said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He is downstairs outside your current location in Queens, a black Lincoln Navigator. You have 5 minutes to come down, or I will come up, and I will not be worried about disturbing the neighbors." Ruby looked at Sarah with wide eyes. How did they find her here? Sarah was unlisted. "Julian," Sarah mouthed, "your employee file must have had an emergency contact linked to me years ago." "Go," Sarah whispered. "Take my recorder." She slid a tiny digital voice recorder into Ruby's coat pocket. "Get him on tape, offering you money. That's coercion. That's our proof." Ruby put on her coat. She felt like she was walking to the gallows. She went downstairs. The black Navigator was idling at the curb, looking absurdly out of place in the working-class neighborhood. The rear door opened as she approached. Omar al-Rashid was inside. He looked terrible. His eyes were rimmed with red, and the arrogance of the night before was replaced by a jittery, intense energy. "Get in," he said. It wasn't a request. Ruby climbed in and sat on the opposite bench seat. The leather interior smelled of the same expensive cologne from the night before, mixed with fear. The car pulled away from the curb, driving aimlessly. "You are a very surprising woman, Miss Vance," Omar began, trying to regain his composure. "I did some digging this morning. A master's in linguistics from Georgetown. Daughter of the late diplomat Robert Vance. Quite a pedigree for a woman pouring water." "My father was a good man," Ruby said coldly. "Something you wouldn't understand." "Your father was weak," Omar retorted, his temper flaring instantly. "He didn't understand how the world works. He got played. But you seem smarter." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He tossed it onto the seat between them. "Inside is a cashier's check for $500,000. And a very simple non-disclosure agreement. You sign it, you take the money, and you forget everything you heard last night. You use the money to restart your life. Go to Europe. Finish your doctorate. Disappear." Ruby looked at the envelope. $500,000. It was freedom. It was the end of the struggle. It was tempting. "And if I don't?" she asked. Omar leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "Ruby, let's be realistic. You are nobody. I can crush you. I can make sure you never work again." I can have you dragged into court for defamation and bleed you dry until you are begging for change on the subway. No one cares about the truth. They care about power. I have it. You don't." Ruby reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the recorder to make sure it was running. "So you are admitting that the Sterling deal is based on fraud? That's why you're paying me?" she asked, baiting him. "I am admitting that you are an inconvenience," Omar snarled. "An expensive inconvenience. The Sterling deal is business. What I am offering you is a lifeline. Take the money, you stupid girl. It's more than you'll make in a lifetime of serving tables." Ruby looked at him. Really looked at him. Underneath the Italian suit and the billions of dollars, she saw a small, terrified boy who had never been told no. And she realized that Sarah was right. This wasn't about the money for him. It was about control. She reached out and picked up the black envelope. Omar let out a breath he had been holding, a smirk beginning to form. He thought he had won. Everyone had a price. Ruby looked him in the eye, held the envelope up, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was incredibly loud in the quiet car. Omar stared at her, his brain unable to process the defiance. "I don't want your money, Omar," Ruby said quietly. "I want the truth." Omar looked at the two halves of the cashier's check resting on the pristine leather floor mats. It was a violent image. Blue safety paper torn through the middle, the zeros of the $500,000 sum severed. "You are insane," Omar whispered, his voice trembling not with fear but with the shock of a man who has never been denied. "Do you have any idea what you just did? That was your life. That was your freedom. You just signed your own death warrant." "Stop the car," Ruby said. Her voice was calm, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We aren't finished," Omar shouted, his composure fracturing. "You think this is a game? You think you are a hero in a movie. I can bury you, Ruby. I can make sure you never rent an apartment in this city again. I can make sure your name is flagged in every employment database from here to Seattle." Ruby reached for the door handle. The car was moving slowly through the gridlock of midtown traffic. "Stop the car, Omar, or I jump out, screaming." You're already on edge about bad publicity this close to the deal signing. Imagine the headlines: "Billionaire Sheikh abducts Waitress in Queens." Omar ground his teeth so hard a muscle feathered in his jaw. He stared at her, searching for the fear he was used to seeing in people of her status. He found none. He tapped the glass partition violently. The driver immediately pulled over to the curb. Ruby opened the door, letting the cold city air rush into the stifling, cologne-scented cabin. She stepped out, one foot on the pavement, then turned back to him. "You were right about one thing last night, Sheikh," she said, leaning in. "You said my father got played. You called him weak." Omar sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. "He was weak. He let sentimentality get in the way of business. That is why he died in disgrace." "He didn't die in disgrace," Ruby said, her voice dropping to a register of pure steel. "He died of a broken heart, because men like you think the world is a chessboard, and people are just pawns to be sacrificed. But you forgot one thing about pawns, Omar." "And what is that?" "If a pawn makes it to the other side of the board," Ruby said, a dark smile touching her lips, "it becomes a queen, and the queen can kill the king." She slammed the heavy door shut. The sound was like a gunshot. She turned and disappeared into the swarm of pedestrians, leaving $500,000 rotting on the floor of the Lincoln Navigator. Inside the car, Omar was vibrating with a mixture of rage and a new, unfamiliar sensation: panic. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed Marcus Thorne. "She refused," Omar said, his voice tight. "She refused $500,000. Thorne's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding genuinely stunned. "Is she negotiating? Does she want 7? "No," Omar spat. "She didn't negotiate. She tore the check in half. She looked at me like I was offering her a disease." "Then we have a problem," Thorne said, his tone shifting from casual to professional. If money doesn't motivate her, she's a zealot. Zealots are dangerous. They don't care about self-preservation. She's taking this personally, Omar said, watching the crowds outside, half expecting her to come back. She kept talking about her father, Robert Vance. Vance, Thorne mused on the other end. That name, it rings a bell in the archives. Give me an hour. I need to look deeper into the father's file. There might be another leverage point, a skeleton in his closet we can use to discredit her. You don't have an hour, Omar snapped. The signing ceremony is at noon. If she talks to the press before then, or if she goes to the authorities. I'll handle it, Thorne said. Just get to the signing, keep smiling. Once the ink is dry on the Sterling contract, we own the narrative. Omar hung up. He looked at his watch. It was 11 a.m. The signing ceremony with Mr. Sterling was in 1 hour at the Rashid Global Midtown offices. He took a deep breath, smoothing his tie. He had to keep it together. He was Omar al-Rashid. He was invincible. A waitress couldn't stop an avalanche. While Omar was speeding toward his destiny, Ruby was back in Sarah's apartment, her hands shaking as she warmed them around a mug of tea. The adrenaline crash was brutal. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, headphones on, listening to the recording Ruby had just captured. A wide, predatory grin spread across the journalist's face. We got him, Sarah said, pulling the headphones off. Ruby, this is gold. It's not a direct confession of the Cayman fraud, but him offering you $500,000 to stay silent on the morning of the deal? It proves consciousness of guilt. It proves he's terrified of what you know. Is it enough? Ruby asked, staring at the steam rising from her cup. Is it enough to put him away, or just enough to make him pay a fine? Sarah started typing furiously on her laptop. It's enough to get the SEC to pause the signing. I'm sending this to my editor and my contact at the DOJ right now. We can get an emergency injunction. Ruby didn't answer. She walked to the window, looking out at the gray skyline. Tearing up that check felt good in the moment. It felt righteous. But now, the reality of her war was sinking in. She was fighting a monster. And monsters didn't go down easily. Sarah's phone rang. It wasn't her editor. It was a secure line, an unknown source she used for deep background checks, a former forensic accountant named Miller. Sarah put it on speaker. Miller, talk to me. I'm on a deadline. Sarah, I ran the names you gave me. Miller's voice came through, distorted and grim. The connections between Rashid Global and Robert Vance. You wanted to know if there was overlap. And? It's uglier than you thought, Miller said. You know how Vance was indicted for taking bribes from that construction consortium in Beirut 5 years ago? The scandal that froze his assets and killed his career. Yeah, the charges were dropped after he died because the evidence was circumstantial, Sarah said. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was planted, Miller said. I found the original transaction trail for the bribe money. It was buried deep in a server in Panama, but I found it. The money that appeared in Vance's offshore account? It came through a shell company. Ruby turned from the window, her breath caught in her throat. She walked slowly toward the phone. Which shell company? Ruby whispered. A holding firm called Desert Falcon Enterprises, Miller said. Ruby froze. She knew that name. She had seen it on a folder in Omar's briefcase last night at the restaurant. Just a glimpse. Who owns Desert Falcon? Sarah asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. It was dissolved 2 days after Vance was indicted, Miller explained. But I found the incorporation papers. The majority shareholder was Rashid Global. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. It was them, Ruby whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. It wasn't just a random framing. It was a hit job, Miller confirmed. The old Sheikh Omar's father needed Vance out of the way. Vance was blocking a pipeline route through Jordan on humanitarian grounds. He was refusing to sign the permits, so the Rashids created a fake bribe, planted the money, tipped off the authorities, and destroyed Vance's credibility. They got the pipeline approved a month later. Ruby felt her knees give way. She sat down heavily on the sofa. It wasn't just that Omar was a crook. It was that his family, his empire, was built directly on the grave of her father, the man she had served water to last night. The man who had mocked her hands and called her a peasant was the son of the man who had killed her father. Every struggle she had faced in the last 3 years, the poverty, the shame, the loss of her home, the humiliation of scrubbing tables, it all led back to the name Al-Rashid. The fear that had been gripping Ruby evaporated. It was incinerated by a white-hot fury. This was no longer about protecting the American economy or saving Sterling Dynamics. This was a blood feud. "Sarah," Ruby said, standing up. Her voice was completely different now. The tremble was gone. The hesitation was gone. The waitress was gone. "Don't send the recording to the SEC yet," Ruby said. Sarah looked up, confused. "What? Why? The signing is in 45 minutes. If we don't send it, he signs the deal." "If the SEC stops it, it happens behind closed doors," Ruby said, pacing the room. "It becomes a legal battle. He'll hire 1,000 lawyers. He'll drag it out for years. He'll settle without admitting guilt. He'll survive." She turned to Sarah, her eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "I don't want him to survive. I want him to burn." "Ruby, what are you planning?" Sarah asked, closing her laptop. "I want to look him in the eye when his world collapses," Ruby said. "I want him to know exactly who took him down. I want him to see Robert Vance's daughter standing there when he falls." "You want to go there?" Sarah asked, a slow smile forming as she understood. "To the signing?" "Where's it happening?" "Rashid Global Headquarters, 5th Avenue. Top floor conference room. It's a press event. Every major network will be there." "A press event," Ruby repeated, buttoning her coat. "Perfect. He wants an audience? Let's give him a show." "We can't just walk in," Sarah warned. "Security will be tight." "You have a press pass," Ruby said, "and I have the truth. Can you get us in?" Sarah stood up and grabbed her bag. "I'm the best investigative reporter in the city. I can get us into the Pentagon if I have to." "Good," Ruby said, opening the door. "Let's go crash a billion-dollar party." The conference room on the 50th floor of Rashid Global was not just a room. It was a theater of war disguised as a sanctuary of wealth. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that suggested the people inside owned everything the light touched. Dozens of reporters, photographers, and industry titans were crammed into the rows of velvet chairs. The air buzzed with the low hum of expensive equipment and hushed anticipation. At the front of the room, positioned like kings on a dais behind a long mahogany table, sat the key players. On the left was George Sterling, the beleaguered CEO of Sterling Dynamics. He looked pale, sweating slightly under the studio lights, clutching his fountain pen like a lifeline. He was a man drowning, and he believed he had found a raft. On the right sat Sheikh Omar al-Rashid. He looked immaculate. His suit was armor. His smile was a weapon. He checked his watch. 11:58 a.m. 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, he would sign the papers, merge the companies, raid Sterling's accounts to cover his own massive debts, and secure his family's empire for another decade. He scanned the room with predatory eyes. No police. No SEC agents. The waitress had taken the money, or she had run away in fear. He relaxed his shoulders. The mouse had scurried back into the wall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Omar began, his voice booming over the microphone, smooth and practiced. "Thank you for joining us for this historic moment. Today, Rashid Global and Sterling Dynamics become one family. We are not just merging companies, we are merging visions." Polite, ripple-like applause moved through the room. "Mr. Sterling," Omar said, turning to the older man with a benevolent smile. He slid the heavy, leather-bound contract across the polished wood. "Shall we make history?" Sterling nodded, his hand trembling slightly. "It's an honor, Sheikh Omar." "Truly." He lowered the gold nib of his pen to the crisp white paper. The cameras zoomed in. The room held its breath. The shutter clicks sounded like rapid-fire crickets. "I wouldn't sign that if I were you, George." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a serrated blade. It was calm. authoritative, and terrifyingly steady. Heads snapped toward the back of the room. The heavy double doors were open. Standing there, flanked by Sarah Jenkins, who was flashing a press pass at a confused security guard, was Ruby Vance. She wasn't wearing her waiter's uniform. She was wearing a simple, sharp gray blazer. Sarah had lent her hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She didn't look like the help. She looked like a judge walking into a courtroom. Omar froze. His hand twitched near the contract. He stared at her, his brain refusing to accept the image. How is she here? Security, Omar barked, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. Remove this woman. She is a stalker. Two large security guards in black suits moved toward her, but the cameras had already turned. The press smelled blood. Lenses swung away from the billionaires and focused on the lone woman walking down the center aisle. "My name is Ruby Vance," she announced, her voice rising as she marched forward, ignoring the guards reaching for her. "And I am a witness to the fraud that is about to take place at this table." "She is a liar!" Omar stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair over with a crash. "She is a disgruntled waitress I fired last night for incompetence. She is mentally unstable. Get her out of here." One of the guards grabbed Ruby's arm. She shook him off with a ferocity that made him step back. "If I'm just a waitress, Omar," Ruby shouted, her voice ringing off the glass walls, "then why did you offer me $500,000 at 9:30 this morning to stay quiet?" The room erupted. George Sterling dropped his pen. It clattered onto the mahogany table, rolling across the unsigned contract. He looked at Omar, his eyes wide with horror. What did she just say? "She's lying!" Omar screamed, losing control. He looked like a cornered animal. "It is a fabrication! A shakedown!" Ruby reached the front row. She stood 10 feet from the table. She looked Omar dead in the eyes, and for a moment the cameras and the reporters vanished. It was just the two of them, the billionaire and the invisible girl. "Ask him about the Cayman audit, Mr. Sterling," Ruby said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Ask him where the capital for this buyout is actually coming from. Ask him why his accounts are empty." "Silence!" Omar roared. "You have no proof. You are nobody." "And ask him," Ruby continued, relentlessly, "about Desert Falcon Enterprises." The color drained from Omar's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the table. Desert Falcon. That was the deep secret. The skeleton key. "How?" Omar whispered, the microphone picking up his terrified breath. "How do you know that name?" "Because Desert Falcon is the shell company your father used to frame Robert Vance 5 years ago," Ruby declared, turning to the cameras. "They destroyed an innocent man to secure a pipeline deal. They planted bribes. They ruined a family. And today, Omar tried to use the same tactics to destroy Sterling Dynamics. He is not a savior, Mr. Sterling. He is a parasite." "Prove it!" Omar shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You have nothing but stories." Ruby reached into her pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder. She held it up like a grenade. "I have a recording," she announced. "Recorded this morning in your Lincoln Navigator. Would you like the press to hear the part where you admit the money for this deal doesn't technically exist? Or the part where you threaten to destroy my life if I don't take your hush money?" She pressed play. Omar's voice, unmistakable and arrogant, filled the room through the recorder's tiny speaker, amplified by the stunned silence of the crowd. "The Sterling deal is business. I am admitting that you are an inconvenience. Take the money, you stupid girl." George Sterling stood up slowly. He looked at the contract, then at the man he had almost sold his legacy to. He picked up the contract and tore it down the middle. "Get out," Sterling whispered to Omar. "Get out of my building." "No, George, wait, I can explain," Omar stammered, reaching out. "It's too late for explanations, Sheikh al-Rashid." The side doors of the conference room burst open. 6 men in windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI and SEC, marched in, moving with practiced efficiency. Leading them was a tall special agent, who nodded at Sarah Jenkins in the back of the room. "Omar al-Rashid?" the agent announced, his voice booming. We have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding securities fraud, wire fraud, and the falsification of international banking documents. Omar looked at the agents. He looked at the torn contract. He looked at the cameras, which were now broadcasting his destruction live to the entire world. He slumped back against the table. The facade of the untouchable billionaire crumbled into dust. As the agents moved in to pull his arms behind his back and click the handcuffs into place, Omar looked up at Ruby one last time. His eyes were filled with confusion, hate, and a dawning realization. "Who are you?" he whispered in Arabic, his voice breaking. "You are just a servant." Ruby looked down at him. She didn't smile. This wasn't funny. It was justice. "You told me last night that my father was weak," Ruby replied in perfect, classical Arabic, her voice soft but carrying the weight of years of suffering. "You said he got played. But you forgot the old proverb, Omar." She leaned in closer as the agents hauled him up. "The daughter of a lion is still a lion," she whispered in Arabic. "I am the invisible girl, and I just cleaned your table." The flashbulbs blinded him as he was led away, head bowed, dragging his feet. George Sterling walked around the table. He looked shaken, aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He approached Ruby and extended a hand. "Miss Vance," Sterling said, his voice trembling, "if what you say about your father is true, then I owe you more than just my company. I owe you an apology on behalf of an industry that let men like him operate. You just saved thousands of jobs." "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Sterling," Ruby said quietly, watching the elevator doors close on Omar al-Rashid. "Just do me one favor." "Anything." "Next time you go out to dinner," Ruby said, a small, tired smile finally touching her lips, "look the staff in the eye. You never know who is serving your water." 3 months later. The winter snow was falling softly on the streets of Manhattan, turning the grime of the city into something white and clean. Ruby Vance sat in a plush office on the 20th floor of the United Nations headquarters. The brass nameplate on her desk read Ruby Vance, Senior Liaison for Cultural Affairs. It hadn't been easy. The media storm after Omar's arrest was a hurricane. But the truth had come out. The files seized from Rashid Global's private servers exonerated her father completely. His name was cleared. His frozen assets and pension were restored to her with interest. She didn't take the money and move to an island. She used the restored reputation to finish her doctorate and apply for the job she had always wanted, the job her father had prepared her for. She picked up her coffee cup. It wasn't poured by a terrified waitress. She had bought it herself from a cart outside on 42nd Street. She took a sip and looked at the New York Chronicle on her desk. Sarah Jenkins had written the front-page story. Billionaire fraudster sentenced to 15 years. The photo showed Omar al-Rashid looking haggard in a prison jumpsuit, stripped of his Italian suits and his arrogance. Ruby smiled, a small, private smile. She turned her leather chair to look out the window at the city skyline. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And earlier that morning, at breakfast, she had left a $50 tip for a coffee that cost $3. What an incredible, satisfying ending. It just goes to show that you should never judge a book by its cover, and you should definitely never assume that the person serving your coffee is powerless. Omar thought his money made him a god, but he forgot that dignity and intelligence are things you can't buy. Ruby didn't just win. She cleared her father's name and proved that the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. If you enjoyed this dramatic story of karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new video. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever seen someone regret being rude to a worker? Or have you ever had a moment where you surprised someone who underestimated you? Let me know your story down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.